Closing is the day you'll work towards in every transaction. At closing, parties to a real estate transaction connect all the loose threads. Buyers sign loan documents. Sellers sign deeds. Buyers receive new house keys. Sellers turn their property into cash. Lenders make it all possible by becoming long-term partners with buyers. Sellers, lawyers, closing agents, title insurers, and real estate agents are paid. Usually, everyone's happy. Okay, you might say, that sounds nice but vague. What actually happens at closing, and why is it so important? Let's clear up the mystery with a story. Imagine Gertrude wants to sell her house and hires Tom as her agent. They list Gertrude's house for $300,000. If the house sells at that price, Tom's brokerage firm will earn $18,000 in commission. Agent Tom finds Cynthia, who loves Gertrude's house. Gertrude and Cynthia sign a purchase contract spelling out the terms of their deal. However, Cynthia only has $31,000 in cash. She has to borrow some money, actually a lot of money, to buy Gertrude's house. Who will lend Cynthia the $269,000 she doesn't have? Borrow Money Bank will lend Cynthia $269,000. Cynthia's credit is good and she has a steady income. However, Borrow Money Bank wants some things in exchange. Borrow Money wants Cynthia to pay interest on the loan, and it wants protection if Cynthia doesn't repay the money. To get this protection, Borrow Money Bank wants Cynthia to sign a promissory note and a mortgage deed. The mortgage deed will give Borrow Money a powerful legal right called foreclosure. If Cynthia stops paying her loan payments, the mortgage deed allows Borrow Money to take possession of Cynthia's house, sell it, and repay the loan from the proceeds. Foreclosure is an awesome power for Borrow Money Bank to hold over Cynthia. But without Borrow Money's loan, Cynthia wouldn't have a chance of buying Gertrude's house. She's happy to have that chance, so she's willing to give Borrow Money that power. So let's review the situation. Gertrude wants $300,000 for her house. Cynthia wants Borrow Money to lend her $269,000 so she can buy Gertrude's house. Borrow Money Bank wants Cynthia to agree to repay her loan with interest and to give Borrow Money the right to foreclose if she doesn't pay. At closing, the parties resolve all their nested needs by signing all the paperwork necessary to finalize these transactions. Cynthia will sign the promissory note and the mortgage deed, protecting Borrow Money's interests in the loan and the property. Borrow Money will issue the checks giving Cynthia $269,000. After Borrow Money gives Cynthia the money, Cynthia can cut her own check to Gertrude for $300,000. Finally, Gertrude will sign a deed transferring legal title of the house from Gertrude to Cynthia. And, of course, Gertrude will cut a check for Agent Tom's commission. Notice there are two big steps to this closing. The money must come first. There are some cash transactions in real estate, but they are rare. Usually, a lender is involved, and the buyer must close on the loan agreement with the lender first to get the money she needs to buy the house. Then, and only then, can the buyer and the seller close on their purchase contract. First comes the closing on the loan, then comes the closing on the property. The entire transaction will only complete when the buyer has the money to fulfill the purchase contract. At any closing, not just Cynthia's and Gertrude's, the buyer and seller have different concerns. The buyer wants to make sure that the seller can convey clear title to the property. Does the seller have a mortgage of her own which the seller needs to discharge? Has a contractor placed a lien on the property for a home repair which the seller hasn't paid for? If so, the buyer needs to know that the seller has cleared up these clouds on the title. The buyer also needs to know that she'll receive a valid deed for the property. Does the deed property describe the property that she's buying? Will the deed provide clear transfer of title from the seller to the buyer? The buyer's lawyer will have to review the deed to make sure it's legally sufficient. The buyer also wants to make sure the property's condition hasn't changed for the worse since she signed the contract. She needs to know that all inspections have been finished and, if the purchase contract requires repairs, that the seller has completed the repairs. The best way to make sure these things happened is to do a final walkthrough or inspection just before the closing. Finally, the buyer needs to know that the lender has approved her loan and that the money is actually available at the closing. Everyone who needs to be paid, the seller, the lawyers, the title insurer, or the agent, needs to be paid. The lender's concerns overlap with the buyer's in many ways. Like the buyer, the lender needs to know that clear title to the property exists and that the seller is conveying the title with a valid deed. In addition, the lender needs to know it has protected its future interest in the property with a binding mortgage deed. The seller's concerns are usually the simplest. The seller needs to know that the buyer has enough money to pay for the property and fulfill the purchase contract. The closing affects the interests of many other people as well: title insurers, lawyers, closing agents, government regulators, and real estate agents, to name a few. We'll talk about these interests in later lessons. For now, it's enough to know that closing is that magical place and time when the parties address and resolve all their unresolved interests and concerns. Usually, they do this first by closing the loan and then by closing the sale. Most of these concerns are resolved through documents like title reports, settlement statements, warranty deeds, mortgage deeds, and checks. We'll discuss all these topics and more in the lessons ahead, and by the time you finish this chapter, the closing process will no longer feel like a mystery.